The meeting was scheduled for 3 hours. It had a formal agenda, distributed to all 11 members of the Veloth High Command 4 days in advance. It had a designated facilitator, a prepared briefing package, and a projected outcome, a consolidated assessment of human, military, and strategic vulnerability, to be used as the foundational document for the campaign plan that was already in early development in 3 separate divisions of the Veloth Strategic Directorate. The meeting began on time. The Veloth High Command did not begin meetings late. Punctuality was, within Veloth institutional culture, not merely a courtesy but a signal, a demonstration that the people in the room were serious about the work, that they respected the time of their colleagues, and that the institution they represented was one that did not allow small failures of discipline to accumulate into larger ones. At the 3-hour mark, the meeting had not concluded. At the 5-hour mark, it had still not concluded. At the 7-hour mark, 3 members of the High Command had requested brief recesses for consultation with their respective divisions. These requests were unusual. In 40 years of the current command structure, recesses for external consultation during formal sessions had been requested 4 times. 3 of them had occurred in this meeting. At the 9-hour mark, the facilitator, a career analyst named Veloth, who had been facilitating senior assessments for 22 years, and who had, until this meeting, considered himself to have encountered most of the ways a structured discussion could become difficult, suspended the session, and filed a formal request with the command chair for an extension and a restructuring of the briefing package. The request noted, in the careful language of someone who has been trained to describe problems without dramatizing them, that the session had identified significant analytical gaps in the current assessment framework that required additional investigation before a consolidated finding could be responsibly issued. The request was approved. The additional investigation took 4 months. At the end of the 4 months, a revised briefing package was distributed. A new session was scheduled. The session was attended by all 11 members of the High Command. It also did not conclude. The briefing package that had been distributed before the first meeting was not, by the standards of Veloth strategic analysis, unusual. It followed the standard format: threat profile, capability assessment, vulnerability analysis, strategic opportunity evaluation. The sections were well-sourced. The data was current. The analysts who had prepared it were senior members of the Strategic Directorate with combined experience exceeding 200 years. The vulnerability analysis section was 64 pages. It covered every dimension of human strategic capability that the Veloth intelligence apparatus had been able to assess: military force structure, industrial capacity, resource distribution, political cohesion under pressure, communication infrastructure, population distribution, and its relationship to strategic depth. The section was thorough. It was, within its own terms, accurate. The data points it contained were individually correct. The problem that emerged in the first session, the problem that sent Veloth back to the Strategic Directorate with a request for additional investigation, was not with any individual data point. The problem was with the section's conclusion. The conclusion read, based on the foregoing analysis, the primary human strategic vulnerability is their political fragmentation. Human political systems are multiple, competitive, and frequently non-cooperative. In a sustained engagement, this fragmentation will prevent the coordinated response necessary for effective resistance. The timeline to political paralysis under sustained pressure is estimated at 4 to 7 standard cycles. This conclusion had been reviewed and approved by 6 senior analysts before the briefing package was distributed. It was not, by any measure, a hasty judgment. It was the kind of conclusion that emerges from careful analysis and is then reviewed and confirmed and refined through the kind of institutional process designed to catch errors. It had gone through that process. It had emerged. It was in the package. And the first hour of the meeting had been devoted to the other sections, and then the second hour had addressed the capability assessment, and then the meeting had reached the vulnerability analysis section. And the command chair, Executor Prime Dal Sovereign, had read the conclusion aloud, as was his practice. And then he had set down the document and looked at the room. And he had said the thing that converted a 3-hour scheduled session into a 9-hour unresolved discussion. He had said, "Does anyone in this room believe this conclusion?" Executor Prime Sovereign was not a person given to dramatic gestures. He had held his position for 11 years, and before that had served in the directorate for 26, and he had the quality of stillness that long service in consequential positions produces in people who have decided that the way to manage the weight of their decisions is to carry them without display. He had read the conclusion and asked his question in the same tone he used for procedural matters. It was a quiet question. It was also the kind of question that changes the shape of a meeting immediately and irrevocably, because it is the kind of question that cannot be answered without saying something true. The room was silent for approximately 30 seconds. Then Sub-Commander Veloth Var, who commanded the Veloth 3rd Strategic Division, and who had a reputation for speaking precisely and infrequently, said, "No." Another silence. Then, gradually, the rest of the room. Some said no directly. Some said it with qualifications, not with confidence, not in its current form, not for the timeline stated. But when Soras Veth, following his facilitator's instinct, went around the table and asked each member directly, every member of the High Command expressed some form of doubt about the conclusion. This was, in itself, a significant fact. The conclusion had passed 6 layers of analytical review. It had been approved by people whose professional function was to identify exactly this kind of problem. It had arrived at the High Command as a settled judgment. And every member of the High Command, on direct question, said they did not believe it. Sovereign let this sit for a moment. Then, he said, "We have a problem that is not with the data. We have a problem with the framework we are using to interpret the data." This was the observation that turned a 3-hour meeting into something that could not be finished, because a problem with the framework is not a problem that can be addressed by additional data. Additional data, interpreted through the same framework, produces the same kind of conclusion. The problem is prior to the data. The problem is in what the data is being asked to mean. Sub-Commander Veloth Var had been skeptical of the conclusion before the meeting began. He had read the briefing package 2 days in advance, which was his practice, and he had spent those 2 days trying to identify precisely what was bothering him about the vulnerability analysis. He had found it, eventually, on the 3rd reading. The analysis assumed that human political fragmentation was a structural weakness in the same way that a building's foundation is structurally weak when it is cracked, that the fragmentation was a flaw in the system, reducing its capacity to function. What the analysis had not considered was whether the fragmentation was functional. This was a distinction that sounded, when first stated, like a semantic quibble. Var had spent 2 days making sure it was not. A system in which the components are unified under central authority is highly efficient when the central authority's judgment is correct. When the central authority's judgment is wrong, the entire system executes the wrong judgment. There is no mechanism for correction until the central authority recognizes its error and corrects it, which depends on the central authority's capacity for self-correction under pressure. A system in which the components are competitive and non-cooperative is inefficient in ordinary circumstances. Resources are spent on competition that could be spent on common objectives. Decisions that could be made once are made multiple times, differently, with friction and conflict. The system appears, from the outside, to be failing to cooperate when it could be cooperating. Under pressure, the 2 systems behave differently. The unified system responds quickly and decisively because there is one decision-making node and it decides. If the decision is correct, the response is highly effective. If the decision is incorrect, the entire system is executing the wrong response and will continue doing so until the error is recognized. The fragmented system responds slowly and with apparent confusion because there are many decision-making nodes and they do not initially agree. The response looks, from the outside, like dysfunction. But each of the decision-making nodes is making its own assessment of the actual situation. Each of them is developing its own response. And when enough of them arrive, independently at a similar conclusion, not because they were directed to, but because the situation itself pushed them there. The response that emerges is one that has been tested in parallel by multiple independent assessments, each of which had the capacity to identify errors that the others might have missed. The human political system was not a cracked foundation. It was a distributed error correction mechanism. Under sustained pressure, it did not produce paralysis. It produced a messy, contentious, argumentative process that looked like paralysis, and was, underneath the argument and the contention, a process by which errors were identified and corrected in real time by the entities that were experiencing them directly. Var had worked through this logic over 2 days and had arrived at a conclusion that disturbed him. The Veloth assessment had called political fragmentation a vulnerability. In the operational context the campaign plan was designed for, it might be the opposite. Soros Veth, returning to the Strategic Directorate with his request for additional investigation, spent 3 days in conversation with the analyst who had written the vulnerability analysis section. The analyst's name was Coordinator Preth Salon. She was 47 years into her career and had produced vulnerability assessments of 11 civilizations, all of which had proven accurate within acceptable margins. She was not accustomed to having her assessments returned for additional investigation. She was also, Veth noted, not defensive about it, which he took as a sign that she had been thinking about the same thing he was coming to tell her. He told her what the High Command session had produced. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I know." He waited. "I knew when I submitted it," she said. "I submitted it anyway because I didn't have a better framework and the section needed a conclusion. The data supported that conclusion within the framework I was using. The framework is wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I submitted the conclusion anyway, because acknowledging that the framework was wrong would have required rebuilding the entire section, and I didn't know how to rebuild it." Veth looked at her. "That's an unusual thing to admit," he said. "It's the accurate thing," she said. "I would prefer to be accurate." She turned to the display beside her desk, which showed a particular section of the human strategic assessment she had been returning to repeatedly over the previous week. "The problem," she said, "is that we are assessing their fragmentation as a variable that affects their capacity in the way that reduced resources or inferior technology affects capacity. As a subtraction. But when I look at the historical record of how their fragmented system has performed under actual sustained pressure, not projected performance, actual performance, it doesn't behave like a subtraction." "How does it behave?" Veth asked. She pointed to a section of the display. "Like a testing mechanism," she said. "Every time their system has been under real pressure, the fragmentation initially produces what looks like dysfunction. The components compete, argue, fail to coordinate. And then something happens that our models don't account for. The components that were wrong stop being followed. The components that were right attract more of the system's resources, not because someone at the top directed this. Because the system is distributed enough that the parts of it that were responding effectively could continue responding effectively, while the parts that were responding poorly were being corrected or abandoned." Veth was quiet for a moment. "A self-correcting system," he said. "Under pressure," she said. "In normal conditions, it's just expensive and slow. Under pressure, the fragmentation that makes it slow and expensive also makes it resistant to the kind of error that destroys unified systems. The error where the central authority is wrong, and the entire system executes the wrong answer until the central authority admits it." She looked at him. "The High Command is unified," she said carefully. "Yes," he said. A pause. "I would like the additional investigation to include," she said, "a review of our own historical performance under sustained pressure, compared against the performance record of fragmented systems under equivalent conditions." Veth said, "That will be a difficult report to write." "Yes," she said, "it will be accurate, though." The 4 months of additional investigation produced 3 separate reports, commissioned from 3 different analytical teams, none of whom were told what the other 2 were working on. The first report was a technical reassessment of the human vulnerability analysis, with specific attention to the historical performance of fragmented political systems under sustained military pressure. It was written by a team of 6 analysts, none of whom had worked on the original briefing package. The second report was a historical analysis of Veloth military campaigns against unified political systems versus fragmented ones, examining relative cost, timeline, and ultimate outcome in both categories. The third report was the one that Coordinator Prethsalon had requested. It was a comparative analysis of error rates in unified command structures versus distributed decision-making systems under high-pressure conditions. It was written by a team that had been deliberately assembled to include analysts who had professional reasons to be skeptical of findings unfavorable to unified command structures, which meant, in practice, people who had built their careers within the Veloth system and had significant investment in its validity. The reports were delivered to Soras Veth on the same day. He read all 3 over the following 72 hours, which were, by his later account, among the more uncomfortable 72 hours of his professional career. Then he compiled the revised briefing package and distributed it to the High Command. The package did not include a new vulnerability analysis conclusion. It included a section marked, for the first time in the history of Strategic Directorate briefing packages, as assessment pending, indicating that the analytical process had reached a point where the available evidence did not support a confident conclusion and that further investigation or a revised framework was required before one could be issued. The cover note written by Veth said, "The attached reports represent the current state of our analysis. They do not produce a unified conclusion. They produce a set of findings that are individually well supported and collectively suggest that our current framework for assessing political system vulnerability requires fundamental revision. The High Command is asked to review the reports and determine how to proceed." The second session of the High Command convened 5 months after the first. The room was the same. The 11 members were the same. Soras Veth was at the facilitator's position, which he occupied with the expression of someone who has had several months to consider exactly how complicated the next several hours were going to be and has made peace with it. The session began with the reports. The first report was presented by its lead author, a young analyst named Veshatorm who had been 5 years in the directorate, and who had developed, in those 5 years, the quality of unflinching honesty that tends to develop in people who decide early that the alternative is spending their career producing comfortable lies. She presented her team's findings without softening them. The historical performance of fragmented political systems under sustained pressure was, she said, not what the existing Veloth framework projected. In the cases where the projection had been tested against actual outcomes, the projection was wrong in a specific and consistent direction. It underestimated the resilience of fragmented systems at precisely the moments when they were under the most pressure. She was asked by Subcommander Var why this direction of error was consistent. She said, because the framework was built from the perspective of unified systems, and unified systems experience fragmentation as dysfunction. When you assess from inside a unified system, you evaluate fragmentation by asking what you would lose if your system became fragmented. The answer is coordination, speed, decisiveness. Those are real losses. But they are evaluated in isolation from what would be gained: distributed error correction, resistance to systemic failure, the capacity of components to continue functioning when others fail. The framework captures the costs of fragmentation correctly. It does not capture the benefits, because the perspective from which it was built does not experience fragmentation as having benefits. The room was quiet for a moment. Subcommander Var said, "So the framework is accurate from our perspective and incomplete for the purpose of assessing a different kind of system." "Yes," she said. The second report was presented by its lead author, a senior analyst who had spent 30 years in the directorate, and who presented the historical Veloth campaign data with the flat affect of someone delivering information they would have preferred to find differently arranged. The data showed that Veloth campaigns against unified political systems had been consistently more efficient, lower cost, shorter duration, more predictable outcome than campaigns against fragmented ones. The fragmented systems had, in engagement after engagement, demonstrated a quality that the campaign records described in various ways, but that the report's authors had eventually unified under a single term: adaptive persistence. Adaptive persistence was the quality of a system that absorbed disruption without losing its capacity to continue functioning. A unified system, when its central coordination was disrupted, experienced a collapse of function that could be rapid and decisive. A fragmented system, when any of its components were disrupted, redistributed function to the remaining components and continued operating differently, but operating. The implication for campaign planning, the analyst said, is that the standard Veloth campaign model, which is optimized for rapid disruption of central coordination structures, produces its projected results against unified systems and significantly different results against fragmented ones. The disruption occurs. The projected cascade failure does not follow. The system continues, at higher cost than projected and on a longer timeline than projected. He paused. The human directorate assessment was predicting cascade failure following political disruption. The historical record of Veloth campaigns against comparably fragmented systems does not support that prediction. The third report was presented by coordinator Preth Salon herself, which was unusual. Senior analysts of her standing did not typically present directly to the High Command. She had requested the opportunity. The request had been granted. She stood before the room and said, "I wrote the original vulnerability analysis. I submitted a conclusion I knew was insufficiently supported because I did not have the framework to support a better one. The investigation this report represents was conducted to address that gap. I am presenting it myself because I believe I owe the High Command a direct account of what the investigation found." She presented the comparative error rate analysis. The findings were specific and documented. Unified command structures under high-pressure conditions showed a characteristic error pattern. The central authority made an assessment, committed resources to that assessment, and continued committing resources to it past the point where the evidence suggested the assessment was wrong, because the structure of a unified command made course correction dependent on the central authority acknowledging error, which was institutionally costly and therefore delayed. Fragmented decision systems under high-pressure conditions showed a different error pattern. Multiple components made different assessments, some of which were wrong, but the cost of any individual error was limited by the fact that it was not the assessment of the entire system, and the components that were wrong were corrected by the competitive dynamic that the fragmentation produced, the same competitive dynamic that made the system slow and expensive under normal conditions. Under sustained pressure, the fragmented systems made more errors in total. They also corrected errors faster, because the correction mechanism was built into the structure of the system rather than dependent on the central authority's willingness to revise. Salon looked at the room when she had finished presenting. "I want to be clear about what this means for the campaign plan that is in development," she said. "The campaign plan assumes a human political system that will experience cascading failure under sustained pressure. This assumption is not supported by the evidence. The evidence suggests a system that will appear to be failing, that will produce, externally, the signature of dysfunction, while internally redistributing function to the components that are responding correctly. The campaign plan is optimized to produce disruption. The human system is structured to absorb disruption and continue operating." She paused. A campaign plan optimized for disruption, directed at a system optimized for absorbing disruption, will produce results that diverge from its projections. Executor Prime Sovereign asked a question after Salon finished. The question was, what do we not know about them that we should know? Salon considered this. "We know their capabilities with reasonable accuracy," she said. "We know their force structure, their industrial capacity, their resource distribution. We do not know, and I want to be precise about this, because it is the gap that matters most, how they make decisions under pressure that they have not prepared for. Clarify, Sovereign said. We can model how they respond to situations their doctrine addresses. We have the doctrine. We can study it. What we cannot model is how the individuals inside their system make judgments in situations that the doctrine does not address. And this matters because the distributed nature of their system means that in any sustained engagement, the decisions that determine the outcome will not be the decisions made by their central authorities. They will be the decisions made by individuals at every level of the system, independently assessing situations that no one planned for and making judgments that no one directed. You are saying, Sovereign said, that their strength is not in their planning, it is in what their people do when the planning fails. Yes, Solon said, that is precisely what I am saying. A long silence. Subcommander Var said, quietly, then we cannot plan for their response. We can only plan for the situations we create. Their response to those situations is a function of individual human judgment distributed across a system we cannot fully observe. Yes, Solon said. And individual human judgment distributed across a system we cannot fully observe is, in essence, the thing we have the least analytical capacity to project. Yes. Another silence. It was into this silence that the session reached its unresolved state. Because there was no answer, in the existing framework or in any of the three reports, to the question of how to plan a campaign against a system whose defining characteristic was that its response to plans was generated by the part of it that could not be planned for. The meeting had an agenda. The agenda had a projected outcome. The projected outcome required a consolidated vulnerability assessment. The High Command had spent 9 hours in the first session and was now some hours into the second, and the consolidated assessment had not been produced. And it had not been produced not because the data was insufficient or the analysis was incomplete, but because the analysis had correctly identified a problem that the framework could not resolve. How do you find the weakness of a system whose resilience is generated by the same mechanism that makes it look weak? Sorasveth filed his second session report 3 days after the meeting concluded without conclusion. The report said, the High Command session of the revised vulnerability assessment has produced the following status. The analytical teams have identified with significant confidence what the human strategic system is not. It is not a unified system subject to cascade failure following central disruption. It is not a fragmented system subject to paralysis under competitive pressure. It is a system in which the fragmentation and the resilience are the same mechanism expressed under different conditions. What the analytical teams have not been able to produce is a projection of how this system will respond to specific campaign actions, because the response is distributed through individual human decision-making that cannot be observed or modeled at the resolution required for projection. The High Command is in the position of knowing, with reasonable confidence, that the original vulnerability assessment was wrong in its conclusion, while not having a correct conclusion to replace it with. The analysis has been completed. It has produced an accurate identification of the limits of what the analysis can determine. Those limits are themselves significant findings. The meeting has not been concluded because the meeting was convened to produce a finding that the analysis does not support. It can be concluded with a finding that the existing campaign plan requires fundamental revision. It cannot be concluded with the specific consolidated vulnerability assessment that was the session's stated objective. He attached the 3 reports and the session transcript and submitted the package to the Command Chair's office. The Command Chair, Executor Prime Sovereign, read the package over 2 days. Then he issued 3 directives. The first directed that the campaign plan be suspended pending further assessment. The second directed that the Strategic Directorate establish a dedicated research program to develop analytical frameworks for distributed decision systems, with the specific objective of building models that could account for individual judgment variation, rather than treating decision-making as a centralized function. The third directed that the second session of the High Command be formally recorded as not concluded, the first time in 40 years of the current command structure that a High Command session had been formally recorded in that status. Coordinator Preth Salon spent the following 3 years leading the research program that Sovereign's second directive had established. It was, by her own later account, the most difficult and most interesting work she had done in 47 years in the Directorate. The difficulty was structural. Building a model for distributed individual judgment required, first, understanding what individual human judgment was doing, what it was drawing on, how it processed situations, what made some individual judgments effective and others not. This required a kind of analysis that the Directorate had not previously done. It required looking at specific individuals in specific situations, rather than aggregate behavior of large groups. The interest was in what they found. What they found, slowly and with many revisions of the methodology and many false starts, and the kind of argumentative, contentious, expensive process that the research team eventually recognized, was itself a distributed decision system producing adaptive results, was a picture of something the Veloth analytical tradition had not had language for. They found people who had, over the course of lives spent in conditions of uncertainty, developed the capacity to make sound judgments in situations that no training had specifically addressed. Not because they followed rules correctly, because they understood at some level prior to rule following what the rules were for, what situation the rules had been designed to address, and what value the rules were designed to protect, and they could therefore act correctly in situations the rules did not cover, by acting in accordance with the value rather than the letter. This was not a capability that could be assessed from outside by observing behavior in designed scenarios. It only manifested in undesigned scenarios. And the human strategic system, by its nature, generated undesigned scenarios constantly. Every level of it every day in the friction and competition and non-cooperation that made it look from the outside like a system that was failing to work. The system was working. The failures were the mechanism. Salon wrote this in the summary of the research program's third-year report, and then she looked at it for a long time before she filed it, because it was the kind of sentence that, once written, was difficult to argue with. The failures were the mechanism. The human system generated friction. The friction generated situations that no one had planned for. The situations that no one had planned for were addressed by individuals drawing on their understanding of what they were trying to do. The individuals who understood correctly produced responses that worked. The individuals who did not were corrected by the other components of the system that were observing the outcome and adjusting accordingly. It was not efficient. It was not fast. It was not orderly in any sense that the Veloth system recognized as order. It was, as a system for generating and preserving the capacity to respond correctly to situations that no one had planned for, remarkably effective. The meeting of the Veloth High Command to discuss humanity's weakness was never formally concluded. It remains in the official record of the High Command in the status that Executor Prime Sovereign designated for it, not concluded. This status is unusual enough that it has attracted attention from historians and analysts who study the period, and who have noted correctly that the not concluded designation does not indicate a failure of the process. It indicates a finding, a specific and significant finding, that the process produced. The finding is this: the meeting was convened to consolidate an assessment of human strategic weakness. The assessment process, conducted with full rigor and in good faith, discovered that the question it had been asked to answer could not be answered within the existing framework, and that the reason it could not be answered was itself the answer. The weakness that the High Command had convened to identify did not exist in the form the framework was designed to find. What existed instead was a system whose apparent weaknesses were not weaknesses. They were the mechanism by which the system absorbed the pressure that was intended to exploit those weaknesses and converted it into the distributed corrective process that made the system harder to destroy the more pressure was applied. The meeting was never finished because finishing the meeting required a conclusion, and the conclusion the analysis supported was one that the campaign plan could not be built around. You cannot plan a campaign against a system by exploiting the mechanism that makes it resilient. You can apply pressure. The pressure will produce the distributed responses it is designed to produce. The campaign plan will diverge from its projections. The divergence will be addressed by the distributed responses. The process will continue until one side or the other reaches a point of decision. The High Command, having understood this, did not reach that point of decision in the meeting. The meeting that was never finished produced, in the 3 years that followed, a research program, 3 frameworks for revised assessment, a fundamental restructuring of how the Strategic Directorate modeled non-unified political systems, and a body of work that was, in the estimation of the analysts who later reviewed it, among the most significant advances in strategic assessment theory the Directorate had produced in its history. None of this was what the meeting had been called to produce. The meeting had been called to produce a vulnerability assessment. What it produced instead was the understanding that the vulnerability assessment could not be produced, not because the analysis had failed, but because the analysis had succeeded, and success had revealed that the question was the wrong question. Finding the right question is harder than answering the wrong one. It takes longer. It does not produce a clean conclusion that can be entered into a briefing package and distributed to 11 members of a high command with a note saying the assessment is complete. It produces, instead, a not-concluded designation in the official record, and a research program that runs for 3 years, and a series of revised frameworks, and the slow, difficult, expensive understanding of something that could not be understood quickly or cheaply, or in the 3 hours originally scheduled. It produces the beginning of knowing something that was not known before. The meeting that was never finished produced that, which is, in the end, more than most finished meetings produce. There is a document in the Veloth Strategic Archive, filed under the designation assessment pending, the first, and for many years, the only document in the archive to carry that designation, that begins with a question and ends without an answer. The question is, what is the primary strategic vulnerability of the human political system? The document is 412 pages. It contains the original briefing package, the 3 commissioned reports, the session transcripts from both high command meetings, Soros Veth's facilitator reports, and a collection of supplementary analyses produced during the 4 months of additional investigation. Researchers who have read the full document in the years since it was declassified tend to remark on the same quality. The document's length is not the result of a failure to reach a conclusion. It is the result of a process that reached a specific and documented conclusion that the question it had been asked was unanswerable, and then spent the remaining pages explaining, with considerable precision and care, exactly why. The precision and care are significant. An analytical process that simply failed would not produce 412 careful pages. What the document represents is something different. An analysis that succeeded at the level of understanding what it was looking at and concluded, on the basis of that understanding, that what it was looking at could not be assessed within the framework it had been given. The framework expected a system with a vulnerability. The analysis found a system in which the apparent vulnerabilities were structural features performing a function. The framework had no category for a structural feature that looked like a vulnerability and functioned as a resilience mechanism. The analysis documented this gap and declined to fill it with a conclusion the evidence did not support. This was, within the culture of the Veloth Strategic Directorate, an unusual outcome. The Directorate existed to produce assessments. Assessments concluded with findings. Findings were the product. A process that concluded with not a finding but a description of what kind of finding was not possible was, by one reading, a failure, a process that had consumed significant resources and returned a non-answer. By another reading, it was the most accurate thing the Directorate had produced in years. It correctly identified what could not be determined. It explained why it could not be determined. It did not substitute a false certainty for an honest uncertainty. Coordinator Salon, reflecting on this in an interview conducted several years after she had retired from the Directorate, said, We were asked to find a weakness. We found that the question assumed a kind of weakness that did not exist. That is not a non-answer. It is an answer that is harder to accept because it does not provide the thing the question was seeking, but it is more useful than a confident wrong answer. A confident wrong answer would have produced a campaign plan that would have diverged from its projections in ways we could not predict. An honest, uncertain answer produced 3 years of the most productive work the directorate had done in decades. She paused. I have thought about this often since retiring. The most dangerous thing an analytical process can do is produce a confident wrong conclusion, not because of malice, because of the pressure to conclude. Every assessment has a deadline. Every briefing package has a submission date. Every high command session has a scheduled outcome. The pressure to produce the expected product on the expected timeline is real and constant. Resisting that pressure, saying not yet, or not in this form, or the question itself is the problem, is the harder thing. It costs more. It produces friction. It requires someone to go back to the high command and say the work is not done. She looked at the interviewer. Soros Veth did that. The high command accepted it. Executor Prime Sovereign redesignated the session as not concluded instead of pressing for a conclusion the analysis did not support. These were not small decisions. They were decisions about what kind of institution the directorate was going to be in a specific moment when the easier decision was available. She was quiet for a moment. The easier decision would have produced a vulnerability assessment. It would have been wrong. The campaign plan built on it would have gone forward. What happened after that is not something I can say with certainty. But I know what the historical record shows about campaigns built on incorrect vulnerability assessments of resilient distributed systems. The interviewer asked what the record showed. She said, they do not end when the campaign plan projects they will end. They become something different from what they were planned to be. And the something different is determined not by the campaign plan, but by the distributed responses of the system that was incorrectly assessed. Subcommander Veloth Var's personal account of the 2 sessions was not written immediately. He was not a person who wrote personal accounts of things immediately. He processed events over time, in the particular way that people process things when they are still living inside them and cannot yet see their full shape. He wrote about the sessions 4 years after they occurred, in a longer document that covered the preceding decade of his service. The section on the vulnerability assessment meetings was shorter than the sections around it, but it was the section that, in the view of colleagues who later read the document, said the most. He wrote, I said no when Sovereign asked if anyone believed the conclusion. I want to record here why I said no and what I understood at that moment, that I had not understood when I first read the briefing package. I read the package and felt that something was wrong with the conclusion. I spent 2 days trying to identify what. What I eventually identified was not an error in the data or in the reasoning. It was an error in the perspective from which the reasoning proceeded. We assessed human political fragmentation the way a unified system assesses fragmentation. As the absence of something we have. We have coordination. They do not have it in the form we have it. We called that absence a weakness. What we did not ask was what they have that we do not, because we were looking at the question from inside a system that considers its own features to be the desirable ones and other features to be deficiencies. This is not an unreasonable starting point. It is what a system naturally does. But it is a starting point, not an ending point, and we had allowed it to become an ending point. The question we should have asked, and that the additional investigation eventually forced us to ask, was, what does their system do that ours does not? Not as a criticism of our system, as an analytical question about theirs. The answer when we reached it was not comfortable. What their system does that ours does not is generate, continuously and as a structural feature, the conditions under which individual judgment is exercised at every level of the system. Their fragmentation forces this. Their components cannot wait for central direction in most situations because central direction is slow and contested and frequently insufficient to the specific local situation. They have to judge. They have to act on their judgment. They have to live with the results of their judgment and adjust when the results are not what they needed. Over time, this produces something that our system does not systematically produce. People who are practiced at judgment in novel situations, not trained to follow correct procedures in designed scenarios, practiced at assessing undesigned scenarios and producing responses that the situation requires even when no procedure exists for it. We called their system fragmented. The word is accurate. It is also inadequate because it names what the system lacks without naming what the fragmentation produces. I think about this often now, not as a critique of the Veloth system, as a recognition that every system produces its own capabilities and its own gaps. Our system produces capabilities in coordination, in consistency, in the execution of well-designed plans in well-understood situations. The gaps are in what happens when the situation is not well understood or the plan encounters something it was not designed for. Their system produces the opposite profile. The capabilities are in undesigned situations. The gaps are in everything that requires sustained central coordination. Neither profile is simply better. They are different. The question of which is more useful depends on what situations they are applied to. The High Command meeting was never finished because we could not produce a simple answer to the question of which profile was dominant under the conditions we were considering. The conditions we were considering were exactly the conditions that activate the distinctive capability of their system and expose the distinctive gap of ours. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is the accurate one. Executor Prime Sovereign retired from command 7 years after the 2 sessions. He did not write personal accounts of his service. He was, in this as in other things, a person who processed internally and communicated institutionally. His final report to the High Command, covering his 11 years as Executor Prime, contained 1 paragraph about the vulnerability assessment meetings that was, for a document of its formal character, unusually direct. It said, "The not concluded designation on the human vulnerability assessment sessions represents, in my assessment, one of the more significant things this command produced during my tenure. It is significant not because the sessions failed to produce a conclusion, they produced an accurate one, but because the institution accepted an accurate, uncertain conclusion instead of an inaccurate, certain one. This is harder than it sounds. There is pressure in every assessment process to conclude. Conclusions are the product. Sessions have scheduled outcomes. Campaign plans have development timelines. The machinery of strategic planning runs on findings, and a finding that says the framework requires revision before a finding is possible is not a finding the machinery knows how to use. We accepted it. We used it. We spent 3 years building the framework it said was needed. The assessment framework that emerged from that process is more accurate than the one it replaced. The campaign planning that follows from it will be less likely to diverge from its projections in the specific way that the original assessment would have caused it to diverge. This is a modest claim. Strategic planning is always uncertain. No framework is complete. The one we have now has gaps that the one that replaces it will address, and so on for as long as the institution exists. But the gap that produced 2 sessions of the High Command that could not be concluded was a gap that, when we stopped pretending we could fill it with available tools and started building the tools the gap required, produced something real. The not concluded designation is in the archive. It will remain there. I want the record to show that I consider it an achievement, not a failure. It is what honest analysis looks like when it encounters something it does not yet understand. The research program that the revised directive established ran for 3 years, and then continued, in modified form, for 7 more. It produced, over that decade, a body of work that fundamentally changed how the Veloth Directorate modeled political systems that were not organized along unified command lines. The change was not rapid. The old framework had been built over generations, and frameworks built over generations do not change because a single report recommends they should. They change because the people working inside them encounter, repeatedly, situations in which the old framework does not produce accurate results, and they build, incrementally adjustments that accumulate over time into something that eventually looks like a new framework. This is, one of the researchers in the program noted in a working paper that was circulated informally rather than submitted for formal publication, itself a distributed process. The change in analytical framework had not been directed from the top and executed uniformly. It had been generated by individuals working on specific problems, developing specific solutions, sharing those solutions with colleagues who were working on adjacent problems, incorporating what was useful and discarding what was not, across a decade of argument and revision, and the kind of expensive, slow, contentious knowledge building that produces, eventually, the thing it was working toward. The researcher noted this with some irony. The directorate, working to understand distributed decision systems, had been operating as a distributed decision system in the process of doing so. It had not been efficient. It had not been fast. It had produced more argument and more revision than a centrally directed research program would have. It had also, the researcher thought, produced a more accurate result than a centrally directed program would have, because the distributed process had generated the same kind of error correction, multiple independent assessments, identifying different problems and developing different solutions, that the research program was studying. The researcher mentioned this to a colleague over a working lunch. The colleague was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We spent 10 years studying a distributed system and in the process became one." "Yes," the researcher said. "That's going to be difficult to write up." "Yes," the researcher said. "I'm going to write it up anyway." She did. The paper was submitted for formal publication and accepted with revisions 6 months later. It was not widely read outside the directorate. Inside the directorate, it circulated for years. Each time someone new joined the research program, someone who had been there longer gave them a copy, not as an assignment, as an introduction, as the thing that explained, before the formal training began, what kind of work they were doing and why the work was way it was. Not clean, not fast, not organized in the way that a unified system organizes things. Organized in the way that the problem required. Which was, in the end, the lesson the High Command meeting had been trying to produce. In the 3 hours it had scheduled, and the 9 hours it ran, and the 4 months of additional investigation, and the second session that also did not conclude, and the decade of work that followed. The lesson was not a vulnerability to exploit. The lesson was a method of understanding. The meeting was never finished. The understanding it produced is still being built. SCRIPTOF Final. The young analyst Veloth Torm, who had presented the first of the 3 reports to the High Command, spent the decade after the assessment meetings working in the research program that Sovereign's directive had established. She was, by the end of that decade, no longer young in the professional sense. She had become the person in the room who had been working on the problem the longest, which meant she had become the person who gave new researchers their copy of the paper about distributed systems, and who answered the questions that could only be answered by someone who had been living inside the problem for a long time. One question recurred more than others. New researchers, reading the original briefing package that had started everything, would come to the vulnerability analysis conclusion, the one that said political fragmentation would produce cascade failure, and they would ask, in various forms, the same question. The question was, how did experienced analysts produce a conclusion they didn't believe? Torm had an answer she had refined over a decade of being asked it. She said they produced a conclusion that followed from their framework. The conclusion was wrong because the framework was wrong. The framework was wrong because it was built from one perspective and applied to a system with a different structure. That is a recognizable kind of analytical error. What is harder to understand is why 6 layers of review didn't catch it. She paused because the next part was the part that required care. The review process confirms that conclusions follow from the evidence. It checks whether the reasoning is internally consistent. It checks whether the data supports the analysis. It does not check whether the framework the analysis uses is the right framework for the system being analyzed. That is a different question, and it is the question that requires looking at the system from outside the framework rather than inside it. You cannot check whether your framework is adequate for an unfamiliar system by using the framework to check itself. The new researchers would sit with this. Then someone would ask, "So what do you do?" And Torm would say, "You find someone whose perspective is different from yours, and you ask them to look at the same thing. You find the places where their reading diverges from yours, and you ask why, not to decide who is right, to understand what each reading is capturing that the other is missing." "That sounds slow," someone said once. "It is slow," she said. "It is correct." She thought about the 9 hours of the first session. About Executor Prime's sovereign asking if anyone in the room believed the conclusion, and the silence that followed, and then the slow, difficult process of 11 people who had been trained in the same framework trying to articulate what was wrong with an assessment that the framework said was correct. "The first session of the High Command took 9 hours, she said, and did not produce a conclusion because the room contained 11 people who all understood the framework and were all looking at the same problem through it. What it produced was the recognition that none of them believed the conclusion the framework had produced. That recognition was the most important thing that happened. Everything that followed, the additional investigation, the 3 reports, the research program, all of it followed from that recognition." She looked at whoever she was talking to. 11 people in a room, all trained in the same tradition, managed to identify that their shared framework was insufficient for the specific problem. This is not common. It required someone, sovereign, to ask a question that the institutional pressure of the situation was against asking. It required the room to answer honestly rather than defensively. It required a facilitator who recorded the outcome accurately rather than resolving it artificially. "What if Sovereign hadn't asked?" someone said once. Torm considered this. "Then the meeting would have concluded," she said. "The assessment would have been entered into the record as complete. The campaign plan would have been built on the conclusion. And at some point, not immediately, not in a way that would have been traceable back to the original error cleanly, the campaign plan would have produced results that diverged from its projections in ways that the plan had no mechanism to account for." She paused. He asked because he was the kind of person who asks. He had held that position for 11 years, and he had learned, apparently, that the most expensive thing a command structure can do is accept a conclusion that everyone in the room doubts. The cost of doubting it publicly in the meeting was a 9-hour session that did not conclude. The cost of doubting it privately and accepting it publicly would have been much larger. The archive entry for the 2 sessions of the High Command is brief, as archive entries are. It records the date, the participants, the stated agenda, the formal status not concluded, and the directive that followed. What it does not record, because archives record what can be reduced to entries, is the quality of the silence in the room when Executor Prime Sovereign asked his question. The silence lasted 30 seconds, according to the session transcript, which records pauses in exchanges with standard precision. 30 seconds is a short period of time. In the context of a formal session of the Veloth High Command, in the presence of 11 senior figures with the session transcript running and the facilitator's notes being taken, 30 seconds of silence in response to a direct question from the chair is not a short period of time. It is the period of time in which 11 people, each of them separately, made a decision about what to say. The decision was not whether to answer honestly. They were people who had reached their positions through careers built on producing accurate assessments, and the quality that had made them effective in those careers was the same quality that made them, in that silence, decide to answer honestly rather than to protect the conclusion or the institution or the 6 layers of review that had approved it. The decision was how to answer honestly about something that was uncomfortable to acknowledge. Not uncomfortable personally, none of them had written the conclusion. Uncomfortable institutionally, because the conclusion had passed review, and saying it was wrong meant saying that the review had failed, and the review was part of the same institution that they served and that they had built their careers inside. They said no anyway. This is the thing the archive entry does not record, because it cannot. It records not concluded. It does not record what not concluded means in the context of 11 people choosing honesty over institutional comfort, and what that choice produced, and how what it produced changed the institution over the decade that followed. The not concluded designation is in the archive. The understanding of what it means to not conclude, to refuse the comfortable wrong answer, to name the gap in the framework, to send the analyst back with a request for 4 more months and 3 new reports, and the acknowledgement that the question has not been answered because the question cannot be answered with the tools currently available. That understanding is not in the archive. It is in the people who were in the room. It is in Sora's Veth, who filed the facilitator's report without softening it. It is in Preth Salon, who said I knew when I submitted it, and submitted it anyway, and then spent 3 years building the framework that would have let her submit something better. It is in Veloth Var, who said no in the first 30 seconds of silence and spent 4 years thinking about why. It is in Veloth, who gave new researchers the paper and told them slow is correct. It is in Executor Prime Sovereign, who asked the question. The meeting that was never finished produced these people, or produced what these people became as a result of being in it. The understanding they carried out of those 9 hours was not in any briefing package or session transcript or formal finding. It was in them. It accumulated in the institution through the decisions they made in the years that followed, decisions shaped by what they had learned in the room about what happened when honesty and institutional pressure pointed in different directions, and someone chose honesty. The meeting was never finished. Everything that came after it was. There is a last piece of the record that bears noting. 12 years after the 2 sessions, a junior analyst new to the Strategic Directorate was assigned to review the assessment pending file as part of her orientation to the Directorate's historical archive. This was standard. Every new analyst reviewed the historical files. The assessment pending file was included because it was, by that point, the Directorate's most cited internal document, cited not for its conclusions, of which it had none, but for its methodology, which had become the model for how the Directorate handled assessments that encountered the limits of the existing framework. The junior analyst read the F. Our 112 pages over 3 days. On the 4th day, she submitted a short note to her supervisor. The note said, I have read the file. I have a question that may be outside my competence to ask. Is there a version of this assessment that was completed? Her supervisor brought the note to Veloth, who was by this point the senior researcher in the program and who received the note with the expression of someone who has been asked, by someone new, the question that everyone who works inside a thing long enough eventually stops asking. Torm wrote back to the junior analyst directly. She said, no, the assessment was not completed. It was determined that completing it would require a framework that did not exist. Building the framework took 10 years. At the end of 10 years, the framework was more complete than it had been but not complete. Framework building does not end. It produces frameworks that are more adequate than the previous ones and less adequate than the next ones. She paused in her writing. The assessment is pending. It has been pending for 12 years. The most accurate thing I can tell you is that this is the correct status. An assessment of a complex system that is actively developing is always pending. The moment you declare it complete, you have stopped accounting for what the system has done since you last looked at it. She sent the note and then sat for a moment, because the writing of it had clarified something she had known for years without having said it quite that way. The meeting had been scheduled for 3 hours. It had run for 9 hours. It had not concluded. It had been pending for 12 years, and it was still pending, and it would remain pending for as long as the Directorate continued doing the work that the meeting had made necessary. And that was not a failure. That was what it looked like when an institution was finally, honestly, accurately doing the work of understanding something it had previously only thought it understood. The meeting was never finished. It had only just begun.